I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. Okay. Hey, everybody. I just recorded a bonus episode. It just launched today. If you want to hear about us reflecting back on the past year, I brought in Nick, the audio engineer, and a longtime listener and a friend, Sarah Donaldson. Totally different format, just the three of us kind of shooting the shit, and some behind the scenes of the party. And at the party, we also had this confession phone where people could answer one of two questions. One was, what's the biggest mistake you've made at work? Can be at any time in your life. And we played a few, they were anonymous, so we played a few on that episode. So if you want to listen to something fun, check out that bonus episode. It just came out on Thursday. The other update I have before I introduce my guest is that I just signed on with Seafair. So I am officially their entertainment coordinator. I'll be working part-time from now until August. They also, if you're not familiar, Seafair does put on the 4th of July party at Gasworks Park. So I'll be doing the main stage entertainment for them, and then also obviously for Seafair. So I'm really excited. If you have any feedback or like suggestions, definitely reach out to me. Contact information is in the show notes. So that's my update. And I want to introduce my guest, Poppy MacDonald, President of USAFacts. Hello.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me in this beautiful location. We're over here in Bellevue, and we are in the Ballmer Group office, you'd call it? Yeah. So, Poppy, a little bit about you. You were previously the president of POLITICO and previously the president at Atlantic Media, and you were on the board of YPO Seattle, and now here as the president of USAFacts. So, can you give the listeners a little bit of what exactly is USAFacts?
Absolutely. USAFacts is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to empowering Americans with the facts. And we do that by going directly to the source. So we go and get government data and make it accessible. And we do it to answer Americans' questions about what is going on in this country. So whether that looks like what's happening with housing prices, is my child's school doing a good job educating them, anything you want to know, what's going on with the economy, what's going on with immigration, we think it's really important to ground that information in facts. And it's really hard to get access to government data. And so we do the hard work of going and gathering the data, cleaning it, and then analyzing it and presenting it in really easy to understand articles and data visualizations.
Yeah, and I think we were aligned when I was talking to Reagan with the PR company that our missions are pretty aligned and that we're trying to get information out to people in a very accessible way. So I think that's awesome that you're doing that work. You are also doing it where it's not biased. So you're not taking any kind of political side. You're not trying to, tell a story or spin anything with your facts. But my question is, aren't you kind of inherently telling a story with facts? So, you talked about how you were getting some data on rape kits and how quickly you were getting the information from them. How do you decide kind of what to share, and how do you take opinion out of that? Because there's ways to tell stories with data, right? So talk to me about that.
It's a great question. It is really important to us that we present just the data with no spin, because we think it's important for Americans to form their own opinions. And we want to be a trusted resource no matter where people are on the political spectrum. Not only do we aim to do that, we're really proud that Ad Fontes named us the most credible and least biased media source in America.
Wow.
And so, we were with all the media companies you've heard of and many of them that you have not, we were right at the top. So that made us, that was a great validation that we're doing something right. And the way we do that partly is we only use government data. We don't do any predictions or forecasts, and we don't tell people what to think about the data. We just go and look at primarily what are the questions people are answering. We use a search history to look at what are people searching for. And then we cross that with a Venn diagram of is there government data that could provide helpful answers to those questions. And then we publish articles, we create data visualizations, we do a TikTok video. We think about all the ways that we can make that really accessible. And it is validating because you might ask, do people really want government data? We have about 468,000 weekly newsletter subscribers, and we have a 48% open rate, which tells us people are opening it and reading it.
Wow, okay.
We had over 15 million people come to our website last year, 450,000 on Election Day, and we've we've got people following us on social media channels as well as YouTube, where we have over 120,000 followers there.
Okay, so people do want that information. I also noticed that you don't do surveys, because I think a lot of articles are like, 1 in 20 HR managers think Gen Z is lazy. And it's like, okay, is that helpful to us? And maybe you're able to see public opinion, but you are reporting on actual government data. Talk to me about how you go about getting this data from the government, because you're talking to different states, municipalities, regions, people, and they're probably doing all different types of research, I imagine. So what is that like?
It is a heroic effort. So it is amazing. This blew my mind, but there are over 90,000 government entities in the United States of America. 90,000 wow. Versus our small but mighty team of 50 people trying to tackle that data. And there are no standards about what data is collected, when it's reported, how it's reported. And so the effort to pull the data to answer someone's question is a mighty effort, not only to make it accessible, because sometimes it's a PDF. In the case of COVID, we were calling county by county. Every single night, there's 3,300 counties in the country. So it can be a big lift, and we think it's really important and it's really rewarding, not just getting the data, because that's just where it starts. What's most important to us then is, are we answering the question in a way that's helpful, that's understandable, like you? We want it to be accessible. Like, there's no point if then we just make people feel dumb because they're looking at a really complicated chart of data. We want to answer the question simply and clearly.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that. I looked at your website and I felt like I could understand, as an average person could understand what was going on. So one more question for you before we get into the stories this week is, how did you get into this role? I know I mentioned some of your past with Politico and Atlantic Media, but how did you step into this role at USAFacts?
I was working in media at Politico, and I got a call about this opportunity with USAFacts, and it was such a perfect fit with my belief that everyone should have access to transparent information, and that includes about what's going on in their government. And when they mentioned to me it's government data, I thought, wow, I don't know of anyone doing that. So I'm super proud of the work I did in media, and I know a lot of people producing great information, great media content, and maybe some people who aren't, but there is a lot of information out there. And what I didn't know is anyone trying to make government data accessible. I also thought, I know customers for that. I would be a customer for that. So I knew people in our newsroom who are working at a frenetic pace don't have time to try.
Because they're citing you, right? Like, they're writing their own articles and maybe they have opinions, but they're bringing in your data to do that. Yeah,
so we're empowering people with that data. So I felt people in media would use it. I felt people I worked on Capitol Hill would use that data when they're thinking about the lawmaking process and what's happening in their state or in their district. And I felt like, hey, this is a really great opportunity to be part of an interesting idea that hasn't yet built an audience. And I would love to be part of making that data accessible, building products that are helpful and useful, and really building an audience and making people aware that this exists as a resource.
Yeah. And how does it relate to the Ballmer Group? Is it funded by them, or?
So we are funded by Steve and Connie Ballmer independently of the Ballmer Group, but we sit in the same beautiful office with the Ballmer Group, with Rainier Climate, and USAFacts. We all operate independently, and we are generously funded by Steve and Connie Ballmer. But the Ballmer Group itself does really great work creating economic mobility opportunities for people in America.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. Cool. So we're going to do some stories for you today, and we're doing something slightly different in that 2 of the stories are actually USAFacts posts. I guess you don't want to say stories because they're not like articles. There you go. Articles. So we've got 5 for you. The first one, we're going to talk about daylight savings. Why? Next one is Redfin is going to be acquired. Then we'll talk about Cheesecake Factory closing. We'll talk about a Pike Place CEO resigning. And lastly, tariffs. We have heard a lot about it, but we're going to find out some more details. So let's jump right in. First one is daylight savings. Why does it exist? So I'm going to do my best to kind of recap what I read, but this is obviously one of your articles, so you know it a lot better than I do. But it was over 100 years ago during World War I, and it was to help conserve fuel and power and extend the workday because you can do more during sunlight hours. And then after the war, it was repealed. We don't need this anymore. And then it was enacted again in 1942 for World War II. So another war, we need more daylight time to fight and things. And then in I think it goes away. And then 1966, they bring it back. And then in 2005, they extend it a few weeks. So that's kind of the history. Do you want to jump? Is there anything you want to jump in on that?
Well, I'd just like to say I'm feeling very tired this week. So if other people are feeling that way, if other people are having to, shake their child to get them out of bed or shake themselves, I empathize. And if you're wondering, why the heck do we have daylight savings? I think you did a really good job explaining it, Rachel. Like it's a dated notion. But what I think blew my mind is that most states have looked at just staying on daylight savings.
Yes.
And they are not allowed to
unless
Congress passes legislation giving them permission to do this. And so I'm like, but I know I go to some states where there isn't a time change. Well, that's Arizona and Hawaii. And what they have decided to do is remain on standard time. So we're allowed to do that, but we're not allowed to remain on daylight savings time. So I just thought this is a really kind of strange policy. I don't know. So that was surprised me about our articles. And so a lot of times it's just explaining to people who are wondering, like, why the heck do we do this thing that like toys with our sleep cycle? And I think it's providing the history, but also providing the context of like, why we can't just decide to change it in Washington state.
I thought that was interesting because I did know about Arizona and Hawaii, and I was like, why can't the others do it? So I didn't understand the distinction of they're staying on standard, whereas everyone else wants to stay on daylight. I also had this memory where I'm like, I swear to God, we passed something. And I remember being like, yippee, it's the last one. And it was Congress that like passed in one area, but not in others. So basically we keep bringing it up. And like at some point it passes in the Senate, but it dies in the House. And then it's going to be reintroduced in 2025. Like we keep trying to bring it up. I don't understand the problem if like everyone's on board. 45 states have considered or passed legislation to shift it. So yeah. And the data, I know your article had talked about any of the data from it, and we're not seeing a lot of benefits from this, and there might be a few more heart attacks. So I feel like this is a no-brainer, but anything else you want to add to that?
I think you did a great job summarizing it.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm glad you're tired too. It's hitting me as well. All right. Our next article is about Redfin to be acquired. So Rocket companies, you can think Rocket Mortgage, Rocket Loans, Rocket Money. They agreed to acquire Redfin for $1.75 billion in an all-stock transaction. This is going to bring together the nation's largest mortgage lender with the largest longtime tech-enabled real estate brokerage. The Redfin CEO is going to stay the Redfin CEO, and the brands are going to stay the same. And the difference is that the Redfin CEO will report to the Rocket CEO. They also, if you remember a couple episodes ago, we talked about how Redfin did a deal with Zillow. So Zillow will be handling their rentals. That deal does stay the same. This acquisition is going to go through probably in Q1 or Q2. So they're going to be acquired. And the process is that both of the boards have approved this, but the Redfin shareholders have to approve it. There were some articles with GeekWire and PSBJ that they thought that Zillow would buy Redfin, but ultimately it was Rocket. What else? Any initial thoughts on that? Anything that stood out to you?
Well, of course, we are government data geeks, so we go to the numbers. So I thought it was interesting when I just was wondering what is happening with mergers and merger transactions, and they have to legally report those to the FTC. And so I thought it was interesting in the last year that we have data for, 2023, they actually dropped pretty significantly. So they were about half what they were in 2021 and almost half what they were in 2022. So there was a decline. However, the percentage of transactions that were greater than 1 billion, which this would be, were higher. So those were 24% of all merger transactions were over $1 billion. And that's double what it was in 2017. So it's like fewer but bigger deals.
Do you think that's because things are more, companies are more expensive to buy now?
I don't know.
You're like, hey, I just bring the facts, all right?
You tell me.
Okay, so what about the housing industry? What do you have to share about housing?
Well, I think since I live in King County, and so do you, we probably feel and hear the stories about how hard it is to buy a home. So I think it's interesting to look at, what does home ownership rates look like? So actually, in Washington, it is higher than the national average. So in Washington, about 66.3% of people own their homes versus the national average of 65.9%. And then, if you scratch your head about, why are people feeling like home ownership is so out of reach? I think it's interesting to look at the home ownership burdened. So if you think about people's income, if you're paying more than 30% of your income on either your housing or your rent, you're considered burdened. That's how the government defines it. And for homeowners, about 41.8% are considered housing burdened in this country based on what they have to pay to afford that home. So I think those are some interesting statistics.
Yeah, that seems like quite a bit. I remember doing that math and they were saying how much to pay. For me, it was for when I was renting. It was, take your salary, times it by 3 or something.
Which also shouldn't be for renting more than 30%. But right. you might have been higher than that. It looks better for renting. It's about 31.7% of income is spent for renters. But for housing, it's quite a bit higher.
Yeah. And then when you're doing these USAFacts, are there certain buckets that you look at? So I know we asked about housing. You had something about layoffs. Or is it just, do you have categories of things that you go into in terms of your data?
We're willing to chase data around whatever whatever that volume of questions is that people are wondering about. Now, if they're wondering how to get Taylor Swift tickets, no, there's not government data on that. I guess that's not a search term anymore, but it was hot for a while. And so we're willing to go chase any data as long as government data exists that could be helpful on that topic.
Got it. I don't have anything else on this one. Do you?
Nope.
Cool. Moving right along. Cheesecake Factory, sad times. The downtown location, so that one over by the convention center, closing down. It'll be closing down May 4th. So if you want to get your last little bite of cheesecake or what have you, there are going to be 119 workers affected by this. The headline said layoffs, but Poppy, you'd seen something else in that article where it kind of made you question. You want to share about that?
Yeah, I saw a quote from the head of HR, I think was her title, saying that they're trying to offer jobs for people at the other restaurants to see where they can place them. Now, depending on, does someone in a Seattle restaurant want to go work in the Tacoma restaurant? That could be a burden in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know how successful they'll be at that or how many openings exist. So it wasn't clear, will definitely all of those people be laid off or how many opportunities or will there be opportunities?
Yeah, and it could have been them just trying to have a better reputation in that article. Not that they're going to, screw over 120 workers. That location did open in 2001. And as you mentioned, there are other locations. There's Bellevue, South Center, Alderwood Mall, and Tacoma. What I thought was curious in this article is that I just assumed Cheesecake Factory isn't doing well, but they had $920 million in revenue in Q4, which is more than Q4 last year. So they're not doing terrible. And I wonder if there were some other strategies. Also, our convention center is growing. We just opened that, I feel like just a couple years ago, the new convention center. We're having more business. I'm quite surprised about this.
Yeah, it's interesting. We always talk about the numbers for the nation are interesting, but what's really more relevant is looking local.
That's true.
And so I wonder what that individual restaurant performance was, right? Revenue versus cost from a business perspective. And I don't know if that was different than the performance of their other restaurants or what was driving revenue. So maybe it had something to do with that specific location's business. Yeah. I don't know.
I think that's reasonable to speculate. So let's talk about layoffs. I know we've kind of said possibly the 119 workers being laid off, possibly not. But what have you learned about layoffs from your research? I know you have a couple articles on your page.
Yeah, and I think when a layoff happens in your community or with someone you know especially, right, it's going to feel the way it feels to you, probably very upsetting or like the ground's falling out from underneath you. Mm-hmm. Looking at the trends, though, I wanted to understand, are more people being laid off? And in 2024, the U.S. job market had fewer job openings and layoffs than in 2023. So fewer jobs opening, but also fewer jobs ending, right? So I thought that was interesting.
I'm surprised because remember seeing all the headlines about all the tech layoffs?
I do remember seeing those. So yeah, you're seeing the big headlines and then you're trying to take the number and put it in context of what's happening in the country. And then looking at Washington State specifically, so 40,000 people were laid off in Washington State as of September of 2024. And if you look at our Washington State's 12-month average layoff rate, it is higher than the U.S. average. So potentially tech layoffs are playing a part there. And our unemployment rate is just slightly higher. So it's a 4.5% increase, or 4.5% is our rate. It's a 0.1% increase from the year before. But King County, Washington had the lowest in Washington state with a 3% unemployment rate.
That is some interesting information. I wonder if that has to do with where companies are headquartered, but I guess King County is still South Lake Union, Amazon, Google, all that. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Anything else you want to share about layoffs, or are you going to miss the Cheesecake Factory?
Okay, so it's so interesting. This is the second, you're talking to you. It's the second time I've talked about the Cheesecake Factory this week.
Really?
And I don't usually talk about the Cheesecake Factory, although it is across the street from our office.
Oh, right, because
But my sister's coming to town. I grew up in Salem, Oregon, and my husband's like, take her to the Cheesecake Factory. And I said, what? And he's like, people really appreciate the opportunity to go to the Cheesecake Factory. Apparently. Don't dismiss it. And so then I was like, oh no, it's closing. But apparently the one in Bellevue is still
You're safe over here.
Yes.
I didn't know you grew up I didn't see that in my research of you. I'm from Eugene, Oregon.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, I love having another Oregonian here.
I know. Very fun. Did you play sports?
I did not.
Oh, okay. I was going to say maybe we played each other in soccer or something.
That would have been fun. I think there's a little age difference too, but thank you. Thank you for thinking I might have crossed your path.
That just happened. I walked into your office, and I don't know what her role is, but she's a fellow Torero and USD. And I was like, oh my gosh, what year did you graduate? And she said 2020. And I was like, nope, I didn't see you there. I missed you. But that is fun. I like having that in common. Okay, so our fourth story is the executive director of the Pike Place Market Foundation. So not Pike Place Market day-to-day operations, but their foundation arm. The executive director is Lillian Sherman. She just resigned. She'd served since 2012, so she'd been there about 13 years. And the foundation is a nonprofit that raises money to support the market. What the articles are saying, and I reached out to her, but I did it kind of late, so I was wishing I could have gotten something from her directly. But apparently, Pike Place had canceled an event called Day of Remembrance, and they'd canceled it less than 2 weeks before, which as an event planner gives me a heart attack. Less than 2 weeks before, and then they apologized and said, "Oh, sorry about that." But the event was planned by Tesoro for Solidarity, a social justice and immigrant rights organization. And the point was to commemorate the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. I don't know why World War II is being brought up twice on this episode. But it's also to call attention to Trump's immigration policies. So they eventually moved that event over to Chinatown. I'm curious how much, like the articles were saying that she resigned because of this, because of maybe the drama, because of maybe her opinions on whether they canceled it or didn't cancel it. But I couldn't get I didn't get a quote from her saying that. And I think that's why I'm like, is that really the reason she left? But she posted on LinkedIn and said that she's going to take some steps away, but does plan to continue to work in the nonprofit field and is ready for her next adventure. So we will see what happens there. But like I said, this is kind of in response to a lot of anti-immigration policies from the current administration. So I know USAFacts does focus on immigration, and you have some stats for us on that. So please share. Yeah,
well, so first of all, when we think about immigration and the impact immigration has on our country, one of the things we want to look at is, immigrants and their role in industry, their role in our growing our declining population, their role in this country. So about 14% of people in this country are foreign-born. And when you look at population growth in this country, and population growth is pretty directly tied to economic growth, to GDP. You need population growth to have GDP growth. Sure. 84% of our population growth in this country comes from people immigrating. And if you thought about restricting that, we don't do predictions, but it would, you'd have to think about where would our population growth come from? And people who live in this country are having fewer children, right? And so I think we provide the data so people can think about what would the impact be of reducing immigration to this country. And then also, what do they do when they come to this country? Certainly, foreign-born workers play a role in holding jobs in this country. And when we look at the industries that would be most impacted for construction, over a third of people employed in the construction industry are foreign-born. So we were talking about housing prices earlier, thinking about, how that might impact that industry. By volume, the largest number of foreign-born workers are employed in the healthcare services industry. And so if you think about our aging population and, what that might do, again, we don't say, should there be immigration or should there not be immigration?
Right.
We just simply provide the data so that people can think about in context, what would the impact be if we increased or decreased the amount of people coming to this country?
And what about this data collection in particular is challenging in terms of how many people are here legally versus how many people are here illegally?
So the unauthorized immigrant population, there's not a good measurement. There is an estimate. The last estimate we have is from 2022, and that's 11 million people are unauthorized to be in this country. And that's held fairly flat across time. Again, it's an estimate. And so when you're thinking about trying to, in 2025, make data-driven decisions, we would say a 2022 estimate is probably not the best data to have access to. And because it's an estimate, it's hard to know, how accurate that number is.
Yeah. And is it hard when you're doing some of this? Do you think about causation versus correlation, especially with immigration? Like, is it lower because of the administration? Is it lower because of a million other factors? Does that cross your mind?
So we don't do causation. That's another one of our principles.
Okay.
But we will certainly show, two numbers side by side. Oh, here's what's happening, with population growth, and here's where the two parts of the population are coming from. Or here is what's happening with border encounters, and here's the estimate of unauthorized immigrants. So you could say, oh, well, because border encounters are up, that's why it stayed flat. Or you could say that might mean more people are trying to come here, and that's why border encounters are up, and so that number should go up. I don't think we know, but we will show that data and let people draw their own conclusions and advocate for what they think is right.
Yeah, absolutely. I had one more question on this, and this is more of a personal question. So obviously Lillian, for maybe there's a reason about the event or maybe personal reasons, she wanted to step down. How did you know it was time? I know you mentioned you got recruited, but how did you know it was time to leave your other job and move to a different one?
Well, so a personal story, sometimes I think if you put something out in the universe,
yes,
it happens. And it just so happened, my husband, who I met in Washington, D.C., but we actually happened to both be from Salem, Oregon. We independently moved to Washington, D.C. We did not know one another. And we independently said, as most people do, we're going to do a 2-year stint in Washington, D.C., and then we're going to go back home. And then we met one another, and we said, oh, when we have kids, we'll move back. And then we had kids. When they get in school, we'll move back. Then they got to school. And I had been in D.C. for 22 years, and my husband had been in D.C. for 28 years. And he said to me, Poppy, how long are you committed to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah.
And I said, what? And he said, 8 years. And I said, 8 years? What are you talking about? And it was a moment where my son was about to go into the 8th grade and my daughter was about to go in the 6th grade. And he's like, if we are going to move, kind of the time is now. Because once our kids get in high school, we're not going to make them move. We're going to be committed here. And then I got a call saying, hey, here's this opportunity.
Oh, so that's what moved you out here.
Was here. I got a recruiting call. Hey, here's would you be interested in this opportunity? And the first thing obviously had to be the right opportunity because I'm thinking, what the heck would I do out in Washington, Oregon that would be as fulfilling as the work I've been doing in DC? And it was making government data accessible to the public. So it was right in my sweet spot. And then they said, oh, and by the way, how do you feel about moving to Seattle? And so it just kind of felt meant to be.
I love that. Yeah, I agree. We would, when I had an episode of the Levant co-founder, it said, if you want something, verbalize it and say it out loud. And I think that really rings true and clearly is your story as well. Awesome. All right, we're going to move on to our last story, which is, again, another USAFacts article. And this is just all about tariffs. There's no way to avoid it. I think right now it's in every TikTok video, Instagram, it's everywhere. And I'm sure some of you all already know this, but I felt it could be relevant and helpful to somebody that maybe doesn't know all the things. I will say that I definitely learned some new stuff in researching this. So The first one, can you please clarify, Poppy? Who pays tariffs?
They're paid by the companies that are importing goods.
Okay.
That's the direct payment. Now, who ends up paying for those, right? It probably will impact the cost of goods.
Let's give an example. So let's say I run a clothing shop myself here in Seattle. I buy some fabric from China. If there's a tariff, then I, as the clothing shop owner, have to pay to get that stuff from China. And then what you're saying is, now that my clothes are more expensive, I'm going to be raising the rates on my T-shirts. Is that right?
Might. I would imagine as a business owner, you might decide to do that so that you're not losing money or so that your profits remain the same. Maybe if you were highly profitable, you would say, I'll just eat that cost. But depending on what the tariff is, I mean, they were saying something today about like 200% on French wine, which felt like it would deeply impact me.
Yeah. Now things are getting serious.
I don't think anyone can handle. I don't think anyone can handle a 200%. I'll just eat that out of my profit margin because there probably wouldn't be a profit margin to cover that.
I think in general, I know I'm trying not to ask you too many opinion questions, but I have opinions. And my opinion is, I think we saw this with the Seattle ruling for like Uber Eats and Grubhub and things like that. We added this extra charge to be able to pay their drivers more. And I think city council just assumed that Uber Eats and Grubhub would eat that cost. But what they did is add another line item for the consumer of like, here's your Seattle extra $3 you have to pay. So I just think most companies aren't going to just eat it if they can help it. So I do think that we're going to see some of that. So some more stuff from the article. It is less than 2% of our federal revenue. So this, I guess, is a little bit more about exports. So when another country is buying something from us, it's the profit or the revenue that we're bringing in from that. It's not that much of our federal revenue.
Well, so it is, and I am like no expert here, but basically when the good is getting imported and coming to a port or coming across the border, it's collected by that tariff is collected by Customs and Border Protection. So that becomes revenue to our country, right? So it's paid by the company that's importing it in America. They pay that. Oh,
so my clothing shop.
Your clothing shop, you pay it. And
I pay it and it goes to...
Yes. And then, someone could say, well, as people probably know, we collect revenue and then we have things that we pay for and we run at a deficit. Pretty significant one, right? Like a 1.8 trillion deficit. And so one might wonder, by raising it 200%, like could we close that deficit gap? And I think that's where that, it's those dollars collected are 1.5% of federal revenue. And so no matter what we raise tariffs, that would be pretty hard probably to cover that 1.8 trillion deficit. Our total revenues are 4.94 trillion and about half, 49%, are paid by individuals through income taxes.
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah, you had a nice little graph on this article. I also saw that over half of our trade is with 5 major places, and that's China, Canada, Mexico, Germany, and Japan. And then in the Seattle Times article, they broke that down for Washington, and that China is the one that we do the most with here in Washington, and the second is Canada, and the third is Mexico. So that's some information for you. The Seattle Times article also broke down, like, what does this really mean for our businesses? So it talked about Amazon, Costco, Boeing, Nordstrom, Starbucks, our shipping, and our agricultural industry. So I encourage you to kind of jump into that article if you want. But for Amazon, some people are kind of back and forth whether that'd be good or bad for Amazon, these tariffs, because it could be good because now, they've been competing with like Shein and Temu, some of these super cheap Chinese companies, and now maybe they don't have to compete quite as much. And they also have a lot of diverse sellers. So, they might have enough American-made ones that they can still be successful. But overall, what I gathered from the Seattle Times article is that it's going to raise prices for everybody here in America, and people are a little concerned about that. But what other stats kind of stand out to you?
For your listeners, I would just say, wait and see, right? Because it's been dizzying. Mm-hmm. There's tariffs, then they're paused, and then they're back, then they're higher, then some get dropped and then some.
Yeah.
It's just been a dizzying, it's been hard to keep up with. So I would say, what you read today might be different tomorrow, and wait and see.
Okay. Yeah, and definitely jump in. I hesitate to throw too many numbers on a podcast. It can be hard to keep track of. So definitely I'll link everything in the show notes at the USA Facts page, and then also that Seattle Times article. I thought it was interesting. And what's next for USA Facts? Do you have a goal in mind? Do you have a future plan for this year or next year?
Yeah, so I'd say one of our very exciting innovations at the end of last year was leveraging AI with a human in the loop. So we're not completely trusting AI to answer people's data-driven questions, but to really scale the answers that we're providing to people. So we had early on really relied on our amazing content team, but we only have so many people. We're a 50-person company to answer people's questions. And that meant we could really mostly do it on the national level with some data visualizations to show by state, once in a while by county. But with AI, you can come to us because you're worried about housing prices. And then if you're willing to tell us what state you live in or tell us a little bit more about yourself, then AI can help us deliver you a data-driven answer that's more specific to housing prices where you live compared to the country, can give you custom data visualizations that chart that out for you. And so we call those answer pages. We've launched about 17,000 of those. Wow. Those keep growing. We're also doing more to explain the federal budget, especially as there's conversations about cutting costs, putting that into context, and explaining more what those agencies do. There are like 440 federal agencies, and like what each do and how they fit into the bigger budget picture. And then I would say additionally, we launched a video series last year called Just the Facts. It's on YouTube. It had over 65 million views, wow. But it's our founder, Steve Ballmer, explaining the numbers behind immigration, behind healthcare, energy, and environment in just the facts, but to give people understanding and context. So we're going to produce more videos, and we're going to think about how to integrate video, how to integrate more interactivity, just how to make this data and this information come to life in a way that, just like you're trying to do, feels accessible and engaging, and people say like, oh, I get it now. Like, I feel smarter, and that wasn't like eating a bunch of vegetables. Like, it wasn't like painful. It was something I really enjoyed, and I want to share. So that's what we're working on.
Yeah, that's incredible and so relevant to me. I feel, admittedly, I don't know a lot about government things, and I think we're all learning about it now. But yeah, what do the departments do? How are things passed exactly? And all the details. So you're doing really great work. I have one more question before I let you go. And typically I'd ask best pieces of advice, but as I mentioned, you're kind of my first guest in season 2, and I want to change up the closing questions. I'm going to try a few out, but this one is going to be, do you have a time where maybe one door closed, another one opened, or maybe you made a huge mistake and it actually ended up pushing you a different direction, kind of that fork in the road moment? Do you have something that's happened to you like that?
So I'm going to go in the way back time machine. You mentioned college.
Yeah.
So when I was in college, I was the first in my family to go to college. I was there because of a generous scholarship. And I didn't realize that there was something called study abroad, or that my financial aid would apply to that, until everybody was saying, where are you studying abroad next year? And so I hadn't done a lot of planning. So I went down to the study abroad office and I said, hey, I want to study abroad. And they said, okay, great. Where do you want to go? I said, somewhere Spanish speaking. And they said, great. Do you have 3 semesters of Spanish? And I said, I do not. They said, bummer. I only had 2. They said, you can't go anywhere Spanish speaking. Where can I go? Oh, you can go somewhere where they speak English. Oh, I don't want to do that. I want to be like fully immersed in another culture. Where can I go? They said, well, we don't teach Nepalese and we don't teach Swahili. So you can go to Nepal, you can go to Kenya. And I said, sign me up. And then awesome. I left. I went to talk to my advisor. She's like, I will indulge you Nepal or Kenya. Poppy, you're a U.S. history major. Your second semester, you're going to Washington, D.C. You're going to get an internship. You're going to do a program there. And so I ended up going to Nepal, living in a mud hut. I learned to speak fluent Nepalese.
Oh, my God.
I did not have access to running water for about 5.5 months, and it was an incredible experience. And then I went to Washington, D.C., where I really found my passion for making information accessible to the public. I got to intern with a media company, and it really, set me on a path for the future. So it turned out really well. Even though my Spanish didn't come along as I would have hoped.
Yeah, that's the downside. But not having one semester of Spanish kind of changed that whole trajectory for you. That's incredible. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Poppy, for sitting down with me and for hosting in this beautiful space. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing a little bit about USA Facts.
Thanks, Rachel. I really enjoyed it.
This has been The Weekly, with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.